I blamed a phantom consulting gig when friends questioned my newfound solvency, but that fabrication barely scratches my culpability. The genuine betrayal cuts far deeper, and still I crave your understanding. Liam moved out 21 days ago, taking our shared existence with him. I scroll through social media, watching my former life celebrate his rebound romance. They brand me transactional and unfaithful. What they miss is that I was suffocating under debt and expectation, and Richard offered oxygen that became poison. What nobody knows, what I've never breathed aloud in the digital slaughter of my reputation, is that Richard wasn't some faceless arrangement from an app. The financial gain was merely the surface. When you reach the final period of this confession, you'll despise me for transgressions that will blindside you. The numbers on my loan statement had stopped making sense around the same time Liam started talking about engagement rings. $89,000 for a degree in strategic communications that landed me a $42,000 role at a firm that celebrated hustle culture while paying entry-level wages. Every month, I watched the interest metastasize while Liam, whose parents had covered his tuition, planned our future with the blithe confidence of someone who'd never checked his account balance with his heart in his throat. He wanted to buy a house in the suburbs. I wanted to stop choosing between groceries and the minimum payment. Richard materialized at a client conference in Scottsdale, where my boss had sent me because I was good with difficult personalities. He chaired a panel on private equity disruption, wearing a Tom Ford jacket that probably cost more than my car's resale value. Afterwards, during the networking cocktail hour that I typically endured by the cheese platter, he asked what I really thought about his firm's marketing strategy. I was 3 Chardonnays into courage, and told him it was strategically sound but emotionally vacant. He laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the room's performative chatter, and handed me a card with only his name and number embossed in black foil. That first lunch at the Biltmore felt like mentorship. He asked about my career ambitions, my debt load, my 5-year plan. I answered with the polished desperation of someone who'd rehearsed these talking points for HR but never spoke them aloud. When I mentioned my loan balance, he didn't flinch. Instead, he shared his own story of medical school debt from decades prior, how a relative had helped him cross the threshold. Sometimes, he said, swirling his wine, the difference between stagnation and ascent is a single injection of capital. He offered me a freelance project analyzing youth market trends for his portfolio company. The contract arrived that evening, $5,000 for 20 hours of work, more than I'd made in 3 months of overtime. Liam noticed my new leather tote immediately. Bonus, he asked, fingers tracing the designer logo. I heard the hope in his voice, the desire for our finances to be merging rather than diverging. Client project, I corrected, using Richard's exact phrasing. Niche consulting. The word felt sophisticated, distancing, truthful enough. That night, Liam mapped out a joint budget that assumed my new income stream would continue. I nodded along, my stomach nodding, already aware that Richard's interest extended beyond market analysis. The first tiny deception had already metastasized. I'd presented a temporary windfall as structural change. The second lunch invitation arrived with a caveat: no shop talk. Richard picked me up in a Tesla that smelled of leather and understated wealth, drove us to a vineyard in Sedona, where the tasting fee alone exceeded my weekly grocery budget. He asked about my mother, my childhood, the scar above my left eyebrow. When I admitted my parents had declared bankruptcy during my sophomore year, his hand covered mine on the center console. You don't have to carry that alone anymore, he said, and the sun caught his Rolex, casting prisms across my inadequate life. I should have pulled away. Instead, I let my fingers curl into his palm, already calculating how much easier breathing would be if I didn't have to do it by myself. By the time he transferred $10,000 to an account I'd opened under my middle name, I'd convinced myself this was simply modern dadding. Liam had his parents' safety net, I had Richard. Both were privileged by another name. The difference whispered to me at 3 a.m., but I muffled it with new sheets that cost 300 thread counts more than anything I'd ever owned. The rationalization tasted like the craft cocktails Richard ordered for me, smooth and expensive, and leaving me hungry for something real. My friend Priya cornered me at brunch, her eyes narrowing at my suddenly expensive tastefulness. You're different lately, she observed, watching me pay for avocado toast without my usual mental math. I laughed, told her I was finally being compensated what I was worth. She tilted her head, a gesture I'd learned meant she was filing information away for later examination. What about Liam? She pressed. Doesn't he think it's weird you're suddenly a consultant? I felt the fissure then, the hairline crack in my architecture. He trusts me, I said, and the words landed like a lie even to my own ears. Priya's silence followed me home, a phantom judge in my passenger seat. The project Richard hired me for concluded, but the payments didn't stop. They arrived weekly, labeled as retainer, bonus, gift. $1,800 here, $3,000 there. I started paying double on my loans, watching the principal shrink with a satisfaction that bordered on erotic. Liam proposed on a Tuesday, kneeling in our living room with a ring he'd financed through a family friend. The diamond was modest, and I loved it for that reason, his earnestness, his belief that we were building something honest. I said yes while my phone buzzed with a text from Richard, thinking of you. I didn't ask what thoughts. I didn't want to know. Richard's request evolved from market analysis to companionship at charity galas where my name tag read guest. I introduced myself as Maya, no last name, to men who controlled pension funds and hospital wings. They assumed I was Richard's much younger wife, and he never corrected them. One night, after too much champagne, I let him kiss me behind the valet stand. It was clinical, precise, his lips soft against mine for exactly 3 seconds before he pulled back. We don't have to, he said, but his thumb traced my jawline with ownership. The next morning, $5,000 appeared in my account with a note for your discretion. I'd become a transaction I couldn't cancel. Liam started planning our wedding, choosing venues that cost more than my remaining loan balance. I'd paid off $42,000 in 6 months, a fact I attributed to consistent consulting work. He was proud of me, kissing my forehead while he showed me color schemes. We're a team, he kept saying, and each iteration of the phrase drove a splinter deeper. I couldn't tell him the money came from a man he'd never met, a man whose texts had progressed from businesslike to possessive, who'd started asking where I was on nights I claimed to be at the office. The architecture of my deception required constant maintenance, new load-bearing walls of fabrication propping up the weight of my duplicity. My sister called when she saw my Instagram story, me at a spa in Paradise Valley, a place I never would have visited on my salary. Mom needs help with the mortgage, she said, her voice flat. I figured you could chip in now that you're doing so well. The guilt arrived like nausea, hot and acidic. I sent her $1,000, money Richard had given me for a handbag I'd decided against. The irony of using my sugar daddy's cash to fulfill family obligations wasn't lost on me, but it was buried under layers of self-preservation. Richard's generosity had become my family's emergency fund, Liam's engagement ring, my entire sense of self-worth. The original problem, my debt, was solved, but I'd borrowed against my integrity at usurious interest. The breaking point arrived disguised as victory. Richard invited me to Cabo for a weekend strategy retreat. I told Liam it was a client emergency, flew private for the first time, drank margaritas on a yacht while Richard's hand rested on my thigh like a mortgage lien. He gave me a credit card in his account holder's name, mine, but attached to his wealth. Buy yourself something pretty, he murmured, and I bought a dress that cost more than my first car. When I posted a photo with the geotag removed, Priya commented immediately, "Where are you?" I deleted it, but not before Liam saw the notification. "You're traveling," he texted. "For work," I replied, adding a location pin from Phoenix that I'd screenshot earlier. The paranoia was becoming a full-time job. Richard wanted more, not just my presence at events, but my weeks, my holidays, my authenticity. He'd started talking about a condo he could rent for me, somewhere closer to my office. The implication was clear: leave Liam, live here, exist within his parameters. I deflected with promises to think about it, knowing I wouldn't, knowing I couldn't. But when my loan provider sent the final paid in full notice, I felt not relief but terror. The debt had been my excuse. Now I had no scaffolding for this arrangement except pure greed. I was taking money because I could, because it was easier than confronting what I'd become. Liam found the credit card statement. It arrived in our mailbox, a sleek black envelope addressed to me, and he opened it thinking it was a wedding vendor. The charges told a story: Valentino, the Ritz-Carlton, a jewelry store where he'd window shopped for my ring. He laid it on our kitchen counter like a murder weapon. "Explain this," he said, his voice the calm before a structural collapse. I stood in our doorway, still wearing my work badge, and heard every possible lie evaporate. The only options were truth or a bigger lie, and I'd become so proficient at the latter that my mouth opened before my brain could intervene. "It's a client account," I said, the words tasting of ash. "He lets me expense things for his events. Liam's face didn't change, which was worse than anger. And the hotel charges? He asked. Retreats, I whispered. Strategy retreats. The silence that followed was a verdict. Priya called that night, her voice tight. Liam reached out, she said. He thinks you're having an affair. I laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass. I'm not sleeping with him, I said, which was technically true in the most limited sense. Priya sighed, the sound carrying years of disappointment. That's not the point, Maya. The point is you're lying about something huge, and Liam deserves honesty. I wanted to tell her that honesty wouldn't pay off the loans, wouldn't buy the wedding venue, wouldn't make me the woman everyone needed me to be. Instead, I said, it's complicated, and heard her hang up on the other end. The first true consequence of my deception wasn't losing Liam, it was losing the right to be heard. Richard became demanding when I told him about Liam's discovery. Leave him, he texted, then called, his voice low and urgent. I'll cover everything. You don't need that life anymore. I sat in my car outside my empty apartment, watching Liam's silhouette pack boxes through the window, and realized Richard saw me as a project he'd invested in, a startup he'd funded and now wanted to acquire. I need time, I told him, but time was the one currency I couldn't afford. Every day I stayed with Liam, Richard's patience thinned. Every day I stayed with Richard, Liam's trust eroded further. I was a fulcrum at the center of two collapsing worlds. The day Liam moved out, he left the ring on the nightstand. No note, just the small velvet box that contained every promise I'd broken. I found myself driving to Richard's penthouse, seeking comfort from the man who'd enabled my destruction. He opened the door in a robe, expecting me, and I let him kiss me properly for the first time, let his hands map the geography of my desperation. Afterward, he transferred $20,000 to my account, a bonus for commitment. I stared at the numbers and felt nothing. The money that had once represented freedom now looked like compensation for services rendered. I was a kept woman who'd kept herself in a cage. My employer called me into HR the following week. Richard's firm had terminated their contract, citing reallocation of marketing budgets. But the HR director's folder contained screenshots, photos of Richard and me at events, emails where he'd signed off with Zoxo, expense reports I'd filed under false pretenses. This is a conflict of interest, she said, her voice neutral. You're terminated, effective immediately. The severance package was generous, suspiciously so. Richard's fingerprints were all over it. He'd bought my silence about our arrangement and my departure from the company in one transaction. I'd become a line item in his portfolio, wind down problematic asset, ensure no reputational damage. Liam's mother called after the engagement announcement was formally retracted from the papers. How could you? She asked, her voice breaking. He trusted you completely. I had no answer that would satisfy her, no explanation that could bridge the chasm between who she'd thought I was and what I'd done. I considered telling her the truth, that I'd been scared, that I'd made a series of small compromises until I couldn't find my way back. But truth was a luxury I hadn't earned. Instead, I listened to her cry, each sob a payment on a debt that could never be settled. The final unraveling happened at a wine bar where Priya had agreed to meet me, her conditions clear, just explain. I arrived early, nervous energy propelling me through a glass of Pinot before she arrived. When she walked in, her face was a mask of pity and fury. I started with the debt, the fear, the way Richard had presented himself as a solution. She listened, her expression softening slightly, and I felt a flicker of hope. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading, did you love him? The room tilted. I opened my mouth to say no, to maintain the distinction between transaction and emotion, but the truth clawed its way out. I don't know, I admitted. He made me feel necessary. Liam made me feel loved. I wanted both. Priya stood, threw a 20 on the table. That's not how this works, Maya. You don't get to be half a person and take whole people down with you. Richard cut me off after I refused his final offer, a condo in his name, a monthly stipend, my existence reduced to a recurring payment. You're being irrational, he said, his voice cold. You had everything structured for you. I realized then that his generosity had never been about me. It was about control, about seeing if he could purchase loyalty as easily as he bought companies. When I told him I needed to try to win Liam back, he laughed. He'll never understand what you really are. The words landed like a prophecy. Richard's last transfer was a penny, a final punctuation mark on our expired transaction. I drove to Liam's new apartment, a studio he'd rented with money from his brother, and stood in his doorway clutching a folder. I'm ready to tell you everything, I said, and his face showed a war between hope and history. We sat on his inflatable mattress, the only furniture he'd purchased, and I began at the beginning. I told him about the conference, the contract, the first payment. I showed him the loan statements, the paid-in-full notice. I explained the galas, the trips, the credit card. His expression remained unreadable until I reached the part about Cabo, about Richard's hands on my thigh, about the kiss. "Did you sleep with him?" he asked, his voice flat. "No," I said, the truth feeling insufficient. But I wanted to be the kind of person who could. He stared at me for a long moment, seeing not the woman he'd proposed to but the architecture of my deception. "That's worse," he finally said, "because now I know you'd do anything for the right price." The folder I'd brought contained every receipt, every bank statement, every email from Richard. I'd printed them out like evidence in a trial where I was both defendant and prosecutor. Liam flipped through them silently, his jaw tight. "You paid off your loans with this," he observed, not a question. "And your mom's mortgage," I added, the confession tumbling out. "And our wedding venue deposit." The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of every transaction that had built our false life. "I could have helped," he whispered, "if you just asked." But asking had never occurred to me. I'd been conditioned to perform competence, to never admit the ship was sinking until I was already underwater. I moved into a motel that night, the kind with weekly rates and a clerk who doesn't make eye contact. My severance money, ironically provided by Richard's maneuvering, would last a few months. I deactivated my social media after Liam's sister posted a photo of him with his new girlfriend, a woman whose Instagram bio read, "Living authentically." The cruelty of the caption wasn't accidental. My former coworkers had all changed their LinkedIn connections to restricted. Priya had blocked my number. My mother, when I called, asked if I'd worked things out with that nice man who helped us, still oblivious to the source of my generosity. I couldn't bring myself to tell her she'd taken blood money to save her house. Instead, I said I was taking a sabbatical, and she praised my courage. 3 months passed in a blur of job applications and regret. I interviewed for positions I was overqualified for, my references mysteriously unavailable. Richard's influence, I suspected, followed me like a bad credit score. Then the final revelation arrived via certified letter. Richard's attorney informed me that I'd been named in a lawsuit filed by his wife, who discovered our arrangement through forensic accounting. She wanted the money back, every penny, under Arizona's alienation of affection statutes. The total was staggering, not just the direct transfers but the gifts, the trips, the credit card charges. $187,000, more than my original debt. The oxygen he'd provided came with strings that had become chains. I called the attorney, my voice shaking. "I'm broke," I told him. "I have nothing." He was unimpressed. "Then you'll declare bankruptcy," he said. "Mrs. Ashford wants her pound of flesh, Ms. Chen. Your solvency is not her concern." The use of my real name felt like a violation. I hung up and stared at the motel wall, where previous tenants had drawn a mural of desperation in cigarette burns and water stains. I'd sought wealth and found only different iterations of poverty. I'd pursued security and ended up with nothing but the lies I'd used as building materials. The process server found me at the motel, handed me papers that meant I'd be defending myself in civil court against a woman I'd never met, for stealing something I hadn't known existed, her husband's loyalty. I had no attorney, no assets, no defense except the truth, which was also my confession. The court date was set for 6 months out, enough time for me to dwell in the liminal space between consequence and punishment. I got a job waiting tables, cash under the table, off the grid. The irony of being paid under the counter after my white-collar deception wasn't lost on me. Every shift, I served people who'd never had to choose between integrity and survival, who'd never understand that sometimes the line between the two is drawn in disappearing ink. Yesterday, Liam's wedding announcement appeared in the digital edition of the Arizona Republic. He's marrying a teacher, someone whose income is modest but transparent. The article mentions their shared values, their commitment to honest partnership. The photo shows him smiling in a way I haven't seen since before Scottsdale, before Richard, before I became a ghost haunting my own decisions. His mother commented, "So grateful my son found someone real." The subtext was a spear through what remained of my composure. I stared at it on the cracked screen of my prepaid phone, sitting in my car outside the motel, and felt the final piece of my constructed identity crumble. That's why I'm writing this from a borrowed Chromebook at the public library, where the woman next to me is researching her own debt consolidation options. I want to warn her, to tell her that quick fixes are just slow-motion disasters. But I don't, because judgment from someone like me is worthless. Instead, I type this confession, knowing it won't pay my legal bills, won't restore my relationships, won't make me real again. The story you're reading is the only asset I have left. This ugly, honest account of how I traded my life for a series of payments, how I let a man purchase pieces of me until I couldn't recognize the remainders, how I told myself I was being practical while I was being purchased. Richard's wife won her lawsuit yesterday by default. I didn't appear, couldn't afford to challenge her. The judgment is enforceable for 10 years. She'll garnish my wages if I ever work legitimately again. She'll take my tax returns. She'll own the ghost of my future earnings. It's fair, I suppose. She gets to extract value from the woman who accepted value from her husband. The cycle of transaction continues, just with different creditors. My lies have become my legacy, the only thing I truly own. And Liam, the man I claim to love while selling pieces of myself to another, has found the authenticity I performed but never possessed. When people ask what happened, though no one asks anymore, I hope someone tells them I was a cautionary tale. I hope they learn that desperation doesn't justify deception, that every shortcut is just a longer road back to yourself. I hope they understand that I know I deserved this, that I manufactured my own collapse with the precision of a woman who thought she could outsmart consequence. But mostly, I hope they see that I was never the villain in my own story, until I became one in everyone else's. That's the final lie I told myself, that I could be different things to different people, and never have to choose who I actually was. The truth is, I did choose. And I'm left with nothing but the lies that built the empty space where a life should have been.